Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro says that intelligence services knew of a plan to try to oust him from power. According to Maduro, it was meant to prevent his re-election, but democracy won out in the end.
Of course, we knew about the conspiracy. It was the Bolivarian government that discovered this conspiracy. The conspirators and arrested them. It was the armed forces that arrested them and imprisoned them. The counterintelligence organizations of Venezuela. Of course, Rick, we knew about it. I said, Rick, in all the campaign, come lightning or thunder, there will be elections. Whoever comes out, we were ready for the elections and for the people to exercise their right to vote. If such a group had come out, probably even more people would have come out and voted, because nobody wants anyone to intervene and try and undermine Venezuelan democracy.
He also says his government is willing to talk to the U.S.
If the government of the United States and President Donald Trump and the State Department or other body wants at any time to establish talks, dialogue, fluid communication, respectful communication, for cooperation between governments, with all the differences we have, ideologically, politically, I would be totally ready to do that.
Former Argentinian President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner has appeared before court for a third hearing. A judge has requested her immunity as a senator to be lifted so she can be detained. She's accused of taking part in a bribery network during her presidency, but Fernández hasn't admitted any wrongdoing. Many believe this is just another example of the political persecution of a progressive Latin American leader. Our correspondent in Buenos Aires, Edgardo Esteban, has more.
After the announcement of preventative detention for former President Cristina Fernández, support for her on social media erupted, showing the disparity between the wishes of the Argentine people against the actions of the judiciary, and also against the stance of the mainstream media that seemed to only work in favor of President Mauricio Macri. Many believe that if presidential elections were to be held today, Fernández would win by a wide margin. There are many similarities between her case and that of former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Another thing that worries people is that the case against Cristina Fernández is being used to distract from the ongoing economic crisis.
And the accusations against the former Argentinian leader came as the government of Mauricio Macri presented its 2019 draft budget to Congress. Macri hopes to achieve a zero deficit by next year, in line with the demands of the International Monetary Fund. Following the announcement, the country's currency, the peso, rose slightly. Since April, the country has been engulfed in a currency crisis. The government insists the budget will increase public spending.
We want to emphasize that this is an austere budget, but with clear priorities. While primary expenditures increased 24%, social expenditures increased 32%. The investment on social security increased by 35%. Health expenditures increased by 29%, with expenditures on vaccines and medicine increasing some 94% over the year.
Ecuador's National Court has rejected the president of the Judiciary's Transitory Council's claim that there is corruption within the judiciary. He says judges should face serious scrutiny.
After an announcement that the evaluation of the judges of the National Court of Justice would be sped up, the president of the court has repeated that the first duty of the judges is to respect and enforce the Constitution. She also clarified that appointment of magistrates was based on a test of merit.
Article 87 refers to continuous evaluation of magistrates towards improving the justice system. It also states that someone who does not pass that test has 60 days to improve and be ratified. This is not a malicious measure, it's just necessary.
The decision to accelerate the evaluation of the judges was made public after the president of the Transitory Council of Justice denounced cases of corruption among the judges. He pointed to increases in the size of their bank accounts.
Any judge who fails to meet the standard must immediately exit. It is then up to the Judiciary's Council. It is established in law.
For some international analysts, the judicial measures taken in the region against progressive governments put at risk the independence of the justice system in several South American countries.
If justice is evaluated, the principle of the separation of powers, of the rule of law, is lost.
The court's president also said that the judges' bank accounts have always been open to investigation. Meanwhile, it is the Transitory Council of Citizen Participation and Social Control which will select the final members of the Council of Justice in the coming days. The new judges of Ecuador's National Court will then be chosen. Denise Herrera, Telesur, Ecuador.
Former Ecuadorian Foreign Minister Guillaume Long warned the UN's Human Rights Council of the crumbling rule of law in the country. Long addressed the Council in Geneva to highlight recent events that violate laws. He stated that measures are being instituted to persecute the opposition, including former President Rafael Correa. According to Long, this is just another example of lawfare that's being used across Latin America.
Until a few months ago, I represented Ecuador in this very council. Today, as a civilian, I've come to call out the collapse of Ecuador's state of law. Our government has disbanded the Constitutional Court, and many other judicial bodies have been directly intervened by political interests, violating the constitution in order to persecute opposition leaders. In particular, former President Rafael Correa and officials from his administration. What is happening in Ecuador is the politicizing of justice, what is known as lawfare, and which we can see all across Latin America. I asked this council to call on the Ecuadorian government to put an end to political persecutions and to avoid any repercussions my speech today may bring.
Just one day after Peru's president threatened to close down Congress, lawmakers say they will approve his 4 political reforms so that they can go to a referendum in October.
Congress achieved in one morning what it couldn't do in 40 days. It gave the nod to one of the 4 law reform proposals and committed to have the entire reform package read by October the 4th.
The plea doesn't change the constitutional frame. However, we have agreed to invite the Ministry Council President to Wednesday's session so he can come and raise his matter of trust.
The Fuerza Popular Party of Keiko Fujimori, which has the majority in Congress, had been blocking President Vizcarra's proposal to tackle corruption. In a televised address on Sunday, Vizcarra threatened to dissolve Congress if it failed to expedite his proposed reforms.
Of all 4 projects, not one has a verdict, not one in 40 days. On the contrary, we have seen congressmen trying to delay and distort the projects with absurd modifications that, if approved, will render them useless and even harmful to the country.
The reforms are proposals that pro-Govt parties consider necessary but insufficient.
This is why we are proposing the country debates important matters. For us, this means a plurinational and popular constitution. For us, the really important issues have to do with the open discussion that the economic chapter must have.
The political and justice system reforms are what the people want, particularly in light of a series of corruption scandals involving all government entities and the judiciary. This is why they took to the streets to demand radical change.
Nicaragua calls for Secretary General of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro, to resign. The government believes Almagro has overstepped his bounds and has failed to properly represent the organization. Over the weekend, the Secretary General said that military intervention should not be ruled out in Venezuela, but he since stepped back on that, saying his words were misrepresented. Meanwhile, protests continue in the country. The opposition marched in Managua, urging the government to release those detained during protest. They also want President Ortega and Vice President Rosario Murillo to resign. I'll be back very soon. Stay with us.
with developing events being presented through analysis. Our coverage transcends borders. With renowned journalist Walter Martinez.
Salud, amigos, tripulantes de nuestra querida, contaminada y única nave espacial.
Dossier. Weekdays. Only on Telesur.
Y ponga usted las cámaras, señor director.
An occasion to enjoy the cultural diversity that defines our South American essence. Come along to find out the story behind these personalities, traditions, and artistic expressions that unite us as a whole. Real Lives. Saturdays, only on Telesur.
Welcome back. The Guatemalan government has asked the United Nations to choose another chief for the International Commission Against Impunity. The government insists it will continue to deny current chief, Ivan Velázquez, entry into the country. It also says the new commissioner must be appointed with the approval of Guatemalan authorities.
I have been instructed to send a diplomatic note to the UN General Secretariat requesting they send the names of prospective candidates in the next 48 hours for the position of Chief of the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala.
In Honduras, the first hearing for those accused of murdering activist Berta Cáceres has been suspended. Now, the victim's family has submitted a request for an independent trial amid accusations of a political cover-up.
Cáceres' relatives and their attorneys arrived at the court with doubt weighing heavily on their minds.
We have information that those judicial orders were not adhered to on several occasions.
The family's lawyer submitted a request for the case's dismissal. This caused the suspension of the first public judgment hearing.
We have presented a legal challenge to the tribunal. Two are accusing them of breaching their functions because they didn't do anything about the public ministry's failure to give us information.
Meanwhile, in the Supreme Court of Justice, the judgment was delayed. On the outskirts of the Lenca community, there have been attacks on Cáceres supporters. A group of people from the Rio Blanco area, where the energy development company is located, even harass persons who fight for justice for the slain activist.
The state and the companies has been instigating discord, but I want to publicly state that these people from the company DSA came to tell us that we are slaves.
Members of Honduras' Council of Popular and Indigenous Organizations, who were led by Berta Cáceres, say they do not trust legal process.
The truth is, we don't expect anything, because we know that this trial has been full of irregularities. We demand the impunity pact that has been plotted here.
The hearings won't resume until the court resolves the matter of the application submitted on behalf of Cáceres' relatives.
According to Brazil's electoral court, former President Dilma Rousseff can be a candidate for the Senate. With 4 votes in favor and 3 against, a court in Minas Gerais decided to authorize her registration. By doing so, the court dismissed petitions that claim Rousseff lost her political rights after being impeached in 2016. Such a ruling would have instead banned her from politics for 8 years. Rousseff celebrated the decision on Twitter. The market for second-hand bulletproof cars keeps racing in Brazil. Residents in financial hub Sao Paulo choose these cars to stay safe in the crime-ridden country. As the economy is stagnant, the second-hand bulletproof car has become the best option for protection. Brazil's $245 million bulletproofing industry is the largest in the world. 157 bodies were found inside a truck in the Mexican state of Jalisco as the country faces the most violent year in decades. We have more in this report.
A truck with 157 bodies was left in the municipality of Tlajumulco in Zúñiga. Residents from the area called the authorities to notify them about the vehicle that was left by the state prosecutor's office of the state of Jalisco.
In the news, they said the bodies were removed from who knows where and they dropped them here. They left them here because they think no one lives in the area.
The authorities justified the action by claiming that forensic service spaces were overcrowded. This has been the most violent year in the last 4 decades. There is no answer from the state, not even to stop the violence, and not even to store the bodies that this violence is producing. The case is reminding people of the prosecutor's office allegedly digging mass graves. This was denounced in Tetelcingo, Morelos. Victims of forced disappearances were dumped there and found by their family members.
This shows the breakdown of the justice institutions. Authorities do not think of the victims and their families. They're not taken into account for the decision-making process.
For some lawmakers, the national security strategy must change with the incoming government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, as promised during the electoral campaigns.
We want to create a commissions for truth that can lead investigations regarding these cases.
Along with these 157 bodies in a fridge in Jalisco, another 147 human remains were found in a pit in Veracruz.
Haiti's Prime Minister Jean-Henri Sant and his cabinet have been sworn in. The new government was ratified with 84 votes in favor, 5 against, and 4 abstentions. On Twitter, Sant asked Haitians to join forces for the happiness of the country. Our correspondent in Port-au-Prince, Daisy Toussaint, has more.
President Jovenel Moïse led the swearing-in of Prime Minister Jean-Henri Sant and the rest of his cabinet. Moïse said he has great expectations for them to help bring Haiti out of the ongoing crisis it's going through. Sant came to power after former Prime Minister Jacques Lefontaine resigned back in July in the midst of heavy protests against the increase of fuel prices. During a presentation of his policies, Prime Minister Sant said the main pillars of his administration will be to fight corruption and smuggling. He promised to help bring to justice those responsible for the Petrocaribe embezzlement scandal. He also said he will help people get better access to healthcare and education and develop systems so that people don't feel the need to migrate. Sant hopes to rebuild people's trust in the government.
Trinidad and Tobago's new commissioner of police is vowing to crack down on Rouge police officers. It comes after police officers were fingered in a major kidnapping that gripped the country's attention for weeks. The commissioner vowed there would be no cover-up officers involved in wrongdoing. He said the police service must instead fight for the rights of law-abiding citizens.
They should be flexible and fair when interacting with the public.
From January 1st, 2019, Jamaica's government will institute a ban on the importation of styrofoam and all single-use plastics. The historic move is part of a phased process of reducing the country's use of plastics and plastic-based products. They also hope to regulate specific categories of plastic packaging materials. Minister with responsibility for the environment, Daryl Vaz, made the announcement on Monday evening. We'll be back very soon. Stay with us.
Acompañamos a los pueblos que resisten, en cada una de sus luchas.
somos esa ventana que se abre para visibilizarlos entre fronteras.
Thursdays, only on Telesur.
We are always there tracking the news. We seek equality. We defend the truth. It's a hard job, but we are not alone. We count on a new ally.
Welcome back. Pro-government forces in Yemen have launched an offensive against Houthi fighters in the port of Hodeidah. The Saudi-led coalition says it wants to liberate the city. The bombardment comes after an 11-week break during efforts by the United Nations to hold peace talks. Meanwhile, civilians continue to suffer in the crossfire. Talks between the North and South Korean leaders have begun in Pyongyang. Denuclearization is the main topic in this third inter-Korean summit. Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un both want to improve inter-Korean cooperation. Moon's three-day visit is the first by a South Korean president to Pyongyang in a decade. Our correspondent in Beijing, Isaura Diaz, has more.
The third inter-Korean summit has started. North Korean President Kim Jong-un is meeting South Korean President Moon Jae-in in Pyongyang. Kim Jong-un actually received Moon Jae-in at the airport, where they greeted each other with a great enthusiasm. Moon Jae arrived along with a number of business leaders, and different meetings have already been held. The next official meeting will be on Wednesday. There are three main objectives for this visit. The first is to promote inter-Korean relations. The second is supporting talks for denuclearization between North Korea and the United States. And the third is de-escalating military tensions so that the Korean peninsula can find peace. Kim Jong-un has reiterated his compromise to denuclearization, despite the fact that talks between the US and North Korea have recently cooled down. This is due to the US's refusal to acknowledge the end of the Korean War until North Korea has acquiesced to their demands. Moon Jae-in has shown willingness to step in as a mediator for both sides, so a deal that benefits all parts can be reached.
We thank you, Saura, for that report. The U.S. has imposed new tariffs on Chinese imports starting next week. The new tariffs are worth $200 billion. Trump's administration is also threatening to target even more Chinese products if Beijing retaliates. China's foreign ministry has already vowed to strike back.
We'll see what happens as to whether or not we're able to do something, in particular with China. That's a big one, because the losses have been staggering for so many years for our country, and we just can't let that happen anymore.
The Congress of South African Trade Unions continues in Johannesburg. General Secretary of the South African Communist Party, Blade Simande, lamented the state of the South African economy. He said state revenue is under severe pressure. Debt, class inequalities, unemployment, and poverty levels also remain high.
Is that one of the key challenges that we face at the moment as a country is to dismantle what, as the SACP we have referred to as the networks around the corporate capture of the state, and combat what we refer to as parasitic capitalism, access to state power for purposes of accumulation, not for purposes of serving the interests of our people.
My colleague Brian Malanga from Moja Media in Johannesburg brings us the details from day 2 of the conference.
It's the end of day 2 and we are at Gallagher Estate in Johannesburg, South Africa, and what stood out for me today once again was that whole topic of gender. Very passionate about gender this conference is. They are fighting for equality between men and women, but it doesn't end there. It goes on to that group that we call a sexual minority group, and this includes the gays, the lesbian, the transgender, the queer, and the bisexual. And what COSATU Congress is actually saying is there will be no space for discrimination within the Federation. There will be no space for unequal treatment.
We thank Brian for that report, and with that story, we've come to the end of this news brief. These and other stories, as always, you can find them on our website at telesurtv.net/English. And also join us on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Estefania Bravo. Thank you for watching.